This is the third and last part of the three-part lectures on modernism in American literature for English 114. We're picking up where we left off with the last lecture on modern poetry and stories. These types of poems and stories can often be confusing to readers because of the deliberate ambiguity. That is something that I want you to keep in mind as you read. If you are surprised sometimes or confused, know that it could be the author is making you feel that way on purpose. In modernist literature, we see several areas that I would like to emphasize. The self is one of them. On here, I have an image of a Van Gogh self-portrait, and at the bottom, a modern take on that same self-portrait, how we are obsessed in our society with taking portraits of ourselves with our phones. In Van Gogh's time, there was no such thing as a cell phone, and although the camera was in use, Van Gogh's artistry was such that he worked a lot with his brush strokes and paintings, capturing his own image. When he painted himself, he considered the emphasis of the imagination and creativity on the way that he designed original works. When we have authors emphasizing the self, we do have that emphasis on imagination and creativity, which does touch back on the Romantic period, and a belief that reality, if it's not something that could be defined, was up to the individual. That's a very different way of looking at reality than we have with something like our naturalist authors, who would dissect reality and look at it like some type of scientific experiment. To say that the reality is up to the individual is such a turn inwards towards emotion that it ends up overlapping with what you see as our third bullet, symbolism. Symbolism is important in the representation of emotion. Symbols can be interpreted differently by individuals who create their own versions of reality. To sum this up, we could look at reality as something internal and changeable to our artists, not external or static. And meaning and truth are located in individual experience. So if we have meaning and truth located in individual experience, that overlaps with the lack of overt morals in our readings. We don't have these overt messages from our readings. Instead, we have truth overlapping with individual experience and emotions. To extend this idea in modernist writings, we see beliefs about God that involve creativity. Our first bullet, humanity divinely penetrated by a creative spirit. The idea that the poet, writer, artist is the creator of their own universe. A belief that Christianity is associated with capitalism and hypocritical moralism. So we have this opening up beyond Christianity in a lot of these readings, and the use of God only as a symbol. So if there's a turning inwards and a lack of external morality, then morality is something that is often individual. This takes us back to art for art's sake. Not art for a moral, not art for a large social message, but art for the sake of art itself. In a lot of modernist readings, we have form as organic and inseparable from content. So you might have heard this term stream of consciousness before, where you have an author who is arranging writing to seem as though they are just moving spontaneously through thoughts on a page. We have stylistic innovations, disruption of traditional syntax and form. You're going to see that where poems don't look like poems you've seen before. Words might go out of order. You may wonder if some of them should even be called poems or not. The idea that art does not have to serve any useful moral, social, or political purpose. This is a repeat of what we had on an earlier slide, so I'm going to move on. So we have artists doing something that we call the avant avant-garde, which means that they're trying out completely new things, cutting edge, avant-garde, cutting edge. The artist began to see themselves as removed from society and actually promoting a bad relationship with the public. We even have that now a lot with our artists. We consider that sort of the lonely artist or the author that's our artist making a statement that is against society's views. A belief that the artist is generally less appreciated but more sensitive than the average person, maybe even more heroic. The artist challenging tradition and reinvigorating it and breaking away from pattern responses and predictable forms. With that, we have one of the poets you're going to be reading, Ezra Pound, coming up with some rules. And his rules were for something he called imagism. I realize that's a lot here because we've already been looking at cubism. Think of cubism and your cubes in your paintings, your geometric shapes. We're within modernism. And Ezra Pound and a small group of poets wrote in a style called imagism. And if you look at that word imagism there, the word image is buried in it. And that's really what you need to have as your takeaway from this. So he sets up these rules. You can just pause and read through, and I'm going to sum them up for you here. Basically, what he's saying is don't put any extra words in a poem and don't make it rhyme. It doesn't need to be set up in a specific meter. It doesn't need to have a specific rhyme. This is so unlike Edgar Poe, by the way. He's saying instead, okay, let's just look at something in close up, look at it like it's an image, and break it down exactly the way we're going to see it. Having strict rhyme and strict meter is going to just mess things up and make it where it's not a good piece of art anymore. So imagism focuses on the image. On the screen, pause and just read this one on your own. This is a type of poem that would have been written before you have modern poetry, and also during that time too. Modern with our capital M again. We still have people writing poems like this that are sentimental, but this is the kind of popular poetry that artists were starting to rebel against. They said, okay, we don't want it to be like this. We don't want to write these well-behaved poems. We want to make poems that are not well-behaved at all. We want to make poems that are about sex and industrialization, that sort of thing. So it's all about the image. Artists are looking to cast off what you, me, all of us were always used to doing with poetry, making it have some sort of message, and look only at the image. They're saying don't be forced to look for a deep meaning, and that symbols are visual and don't have to have a moral importance. So we end up with a famous poem like this one that you'll see on the webpage for the course. William Carlos Williams' famous poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. It's just about the image. And when he wrote this, he was building the image line by line as we go through this poem, just to get you to see the red wheelbarrow with the white chickens. Now, as we read a poem like this, we fill in what's around it. We might fill in a farm scene or something like this. But like with Poe, interestingly, 50, 60, 70 years before, the emphasis is not on symbolism and not on any kind of moral. The temptation would be to look at this poem and say, oh, let's talk about all the things that depend on that red wheelbarrow, and let's dig into all these symbols and the importance of farm life and hard labor and all this stuff. No, that's not at all what William Carlos Williams was going for. He very simply wanted to build this image line by line. So if you took it line by line and you said so much depends, you can't see anything yet. Upon, can't see it, a red wheel. For the split second in time, you might see a red wheel, but then it's a barrow in the next line. So it's a red wheelbarrow. And now we have it glazed with rainwater, a little bit more added to the scene, a little bit more added to the image. Beside the white chickens, a little bit more added to the image. It's just about building the image. We're going to end with the lecture with the idea of breaking with tradition. More poems are going to be on the webpage for the course. The idea of breaking with tradition, here's Ezra Pound, specifically in a poem called A Pact, talking to Walt Whitman, who had died a number of years before. Whitman died in 1891, I believe. He says, I make a pact with you, Walt Whitman. I've detested you long enough. So wait, what? He didn't like Walt Whitman? I come to you as a grown child who has a pig-headed father. I'm coming to you as a grown child, a grown poet who has a stubborn father. I'm old enough now to make friends, so he's going to work it out with Walt Whitman somehow. It was you that broke the new wood. Hey, Walt Whitman, you started new poetry. Now it's time for carving. You broke the wood. Now we're going to refine it, he says. We have one sap and one root. We have the same blood in our veins. We go back to the same poetic root. Let us there be commerce between us. Let's now work together. So we're going to see that in these poems and apply the lecture a little bit more in our voice thread.